A lot of people picture Titanic hitting the iceberg head-on, but multiple accounts describe something far more subtle, a long sideways scrape that didn't feel serious at first. Today, we're breaking down 9 details that change what you think you know about that night in 1912, how the hull was compromised, why some lifeboats left with empty seats, and what the wireless actually could and couldn't reach. Like the video and subscribe to follow this reconstruction with period-accurate visuals. The first detail is simple, but it rewrites the opening moments. Many people barely felt the impact. On an ocean liner, vibration and mechanical noise are normal, so a glancing contact can register as just another small irregularity. While some passengers keep to their routine, the bridge shifts into action with engine orders and immediate checks. The gap between what's happening in the grand salons and what's showing up in technical corridors is enormous. Early critical warnings usually appear below: dampness, seepage, water where it shouldn't be. That's how a disaster can begin almost invisibly. Unsinkable wasn't just marketing, it became a working belief that shaped behavior. If the ship is still warm and lit, people tend to read the situation as controlled. At the same time, crew and engineering teams start doing the work most retellings ignore: closing watertight doors, adjusting valves, moving through service routes. That mismatch delays the crowd's understanding of risk. Here's the contrast: normal up top, trouble spreading below. And at this stage, minutes matter more than most people realize. The second detail is about the damage itself. The iceberg likely didn't tear the hull open as one single, dramatic gash. It may have triggered a chain of failures along the side. If rivets and seams give way across multiple points, water comes in distributed, quietly adding up, without one obvious big hole to point to. That makes the problem harder to read for anyone not standing inside the affected compartments. For the crew, it's the progression that matters. Small leaks, added together, become an unavoidable flood. That technical reality changes the mental picture. Not one giant breach, a growing pattern of failure. Once water begins spreading, the mission becomes containment. Improvised patches, pumps, sealing, anything to slow the advance. But there's a hard limit. Containment works when the inflow is manageable and when you're not fighting multiple entry points at once. The key detail is this: the severity isn't defined by noise, it's defined by how many compartments are being compromised. Even with fast responses, the ship can be, in practical terms, losing the numbers before most passengers notice. This is when the problem stops being local and becomes systemic, and Titanic's system had a very specific math. The third detail is that math. Titanic could remain afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded, but not with what developed that night. As more forward compartments fill, the bow settles lower, the angle increases, and that makes it easier for water to keep pushing forward beyond the limits the design assumed. The outcome isn't instant, it's a progression that feels slow enough to fool people. Meanwhile, command decisions start leaning on estimates and internal reports. This is where "it looks under control" and "it's already beyond the limit" can exist at the same time, and that overlap costs time. With stability slipping, the ship begins behaving differently under stress. Loads shift, tension increases, systems operate outside their ideal range. The detail here is how the list changes everything. Walking, carrying equipment, managing traffic, even routine checks become harder. Small technical actions pile up, but now they're happening inside a situation where rising water matters more than anything else. Once the ship loses its margin, the question stops being "will it sink?" and becomes "how much time is left?" Titanic still looks massive from the outside, but the physics have already changed, and that sets up the next detail, which is about human reaction. The fourth detail is behavioral. Many people didn't believe the ship would actually go down. If the lights are still on and there's no dramatic crash, the brain looks for a harmless explanation. That hesitation keeps some from putting on life jackets or moving to the boat deck right away. At the same time, crew begin preparing lifeboats and trying to shape the flow without triggering panic. This phase is defined by indecision, not total chaos. And indecision, on a ship with limited time, becomes a critical factor. The delay isn't a moral failure, it's how people read the environment. When the order to prepare boats turns real, a practical limit shows up: training and clarity of command. This is where the fifth detail begins to form. Lifeboats can be ready and still not leave full. People hesitate to climb into something small while a bright, steady ocean liner still feels safer. And crew may not have enough hands on experience loading to maximum capacity under pressure. The result is simple. Real capacity used doesn't match capacity on paper. In emergencies, efficiency depends on minutes and on procedures repeated correctly. And Titanic was doing this for the first time in a real crisis. That changes how you understand why so many seats were wasted. The fifth detail becomes explicit. The first boats launched with empty seats, not for one single reason, but because hesitation, mixed instructions, and a lack of practical full load training collided at once. Every boat that goes down with open space increases the number of people exposed to what comes next. At the same time, the list keeps growing, making organization and movement harder. That creates a paradox. The more urgent it becomes, the harder it is to execute with precision. And that paradox shows up again and again in the testimony. It changes how you judge that night. As more boats go into operation, everything depends on two things: efficient repetition and fast buy-in. What's striking is that even with clear warning signs, hesitation still appears in pockets, and that directly affects how many people reach the boats in time. The detail here is how practical variables, where you are on deck, how you access the davits, who gets called first, decide outcomes. If you want to keep following these details with coherent scenes and no anachronisms, like the video and subscribe, because the next point is the wireless and what was truly heard in that early morning. From here on, communication becomes the most underestimated bottleneck, and Titanic depended on technology that didn't work anything like ours today. At the center of Titanic's immediate response was the Marconi wireless, operated under conditions that look basic today, but were cutting edge in 1912. The operators had to shift frequencies, fight interference, and repeat signals to raise the odds that someone, somewhere, would catch the message. At the same time, those calls were competing with range limits, electrical noise, and the routine traffic of other ships. The key point is this: sending did not guarantee being heard. Deteriorated, and that gap between possible communication and effective communication helps explain why help didn't arrive in time. Wireless in that era wasn't a permanent channel with automatic monitoring. On some ships, the operator ended the shift, powered down the set, and the vessel literally stopped listening to the Atlantic for hours. That creates a scenario where distress calls can exist and still pass through the night without an immediate reply. That's why rockets mattered as a backup, a visual signal when routine and technology failed. Even then, at distance, a flare in the sky wasn't a clear diagnosis. It could be interpreted multiple ways. Intermittent wireless and human interpretation widened the critical window of that morning. Once the ship's angle became obvious, the story shifts from doubt to physical dynamics. The bow goes down first because forward compartments keep taking on water, adding weight and pulling the hull lower. On deck, walking now requires bracing, and what felt manageable starts demanding fast decisions. At this point, stability is no longer about comfort or discipline, it's about hull geometry and mass distribution. Water advances unevenly, and the ship begins working under growing structural stress. What comes next isn't one single moment, it's a sequence. Titanic's engineering assumed containment up to a specific flooding limit, but the inundation went beyond that margin. With more sections compromised, the ship can't balance itself, and the hull begins flexing past what it can tolerate. That's why accounts mention sharp sounds, vibrations, and rapid changes in how the structure feels. Crew still attempt containment, valves, watertight doors, emergency measures. But now physics is driving the timeline. flickering lights and tremors aren't cinematic effects. They're consequences of structural stress and systems being affected by list and water. This is where collapse stops being a possibility and becomes a trend. For decades, many believed Titanic went down in one piece, but the evidence supports a structural failure. The ship broke into two major sections. The logic is straightforward. The bow is being pulled down, while the stern is still held up by buoyancy. That creates extreme bending stress around the midsection. Once that stress exceeds the hull's strength, it ruptures, and the sinking sequence changes completely. The forward section disappears first, and the stern remains briefly before beginning its final descent. This also helps reconcile conflicting accounts, because what someone saw depended on where they stood and the exact moment they looked. This is one of the details that most changes the popular image of the night. It wasn't one clean plunge, it was a collapse in stages. After Titanic stops being the center of the scene, the greatest danger becomes the environment. In open lifeboats, wind, moisture, and wet clothing accelerate heat loss, even with relatively calm seas. North Atlantic water was below freezing, and for anyone in the water, strength and coordination can collapse within minutes. That's why the tragedy isn't only about the sinking itself. In many boats, the priority shifts to staying as dry as possible, conserving energy, and holding orientation in total darkness. This is the part people underestimate. The cold can decide the outcome as quickly as the water did. The line between being in a boat and being on the deck became a literal boundary between likely survival and unlikely survival. Once the stern finally vanishes, the scene turns into open ocean with almost no visual reference. Wind, black water, scattered points of light. What's striking, in documentary terms, is how fast the consequences intensify. Choices made minutes earlier now determine outcomes immediately. The night doesn't end with a final ship shot. It ends with emptiness and the realization that technology, training, and risk perception failed in different places at the same time. After Titanic disappeared, the center of the story shifts again. The main threat is the environment. In open boats, wind and moisture make the cold more aggressive, and simple tasks begin demanding coordination the body is losing. Instead of just waiting, survivors have to keep the boat minimally workable, keep the interior as dry as possible, stay oriented in the dark. Accounts describe shivering, numbness, and exhaustion while it was still night. This is where the ninth detail takes a practical shape. Useful time shrinks fast. And that's why dawn doesn't mean instant relief. It means a better chance of being seen. Cold doesn't just affect comfort, it directly reduces the ability to do basic actions. Rowing, holding lines, keeping balance. Even in relatively calm water, heat loss weakens hands and slows reaction time. In multiple boats, the priority becomes conserving energy, keeping people together, and preventing water from collecting inside. As the night thins toward morning, visibility improves, but the physical toll is already there. A shape on the horizon becomes a reference point, but it isn't rescue yet. This phase explains why earlier decisions, made in minutes, determined who would still have enough strength hours later to climb onto another ship. With daylight coming, the problem becomes location. Boats scattered across open water have to be found, and any distant silhouette can be life or death. When RMS Carpathia begins to take shape, the challenge becomes coordinating approach without modern navigation aids. On deck, officers use binoculars and hand signals, while crew prepare lines and blankets for people arriving in a weakened state. In 1912, rescue is manual, throwing lines, stabilizing lifeboats alongside the hull, moving people carefully. The process repeats again and again because the boats aren't all in one place, and every repetition costs time, strength, and discipline. The transfer from a lifeboat to the rescue ship is one of the most dangerous moments for anyone cold and exhausted. Climbing a rope or ladder requires grip and balance, exactly what prolonged exposure steals first. That's why the rescue crew has to work close in, pulling and stabilizing. Once someone reaches the deck, the priority is immediate. Cover them, warm them, reduce the risk of collapse from fatigue and cold. Records begin during the operation because the ship needs control of numbers and sequence. This is the step that turns scattered boats into survivors fully out of the water. With part of the survivors on board, the work splits. Keep collecting lifeboats and care for the people already rescued. Hot drinks, blankets, and immediate rest are basic and absolutely critical after cold exposure. Meanwhile, on deck, lines and signals continue in a repetitive rhythm to bring in the next boat. The scene can look organized, but it depends on dozens of small actions done correctly. Inside the ship, notes and initial records start capturing what happened even before formal investigations. This is where tragedy becomes documentation, counts, shifts, and first reports. After the immediate urgency, a stabilization phase begins. Dry clothing, blankets, and places to rest have to be distributed methodically. Behavior shifts too. Some people focus on personal objects as anchors while trying to reorganize what's left. At the same time, paperwork moves through the ship because communication and record keeping in 1912 is still paper. Pencil, messengers, envelopes. That administrative layer isn't secondary. It shapes how the event will be reported and understood. This is where the details connect in a chain: limited technology, human decisions, and manual logistics. As the rescue ship continues operating, warming spaces and reducing tremors stay high priority. The body keeps reacting to the cold for hours. On board, the contrast with the night before is sharp. Engines run steady, corridors return to routine, while carrying a new human reality. Logbooks and headcounts help organize what happened without relying only on memory. And many start looking at the ocean differently, watching a sea that, visually, can look ordinary. That gap between appearance and danger is one of Titanic's central lessons. When you put the 9 details together, the story stops being myth and becomes mechanism. A subtle impact, distributed damage, compartment limits, decisions made under uncertainty, early lifeboat usage, wireless communication, and the interpretation of signals all reshape the available time in concrete ways. The music appears as a method of control and organization, not as narrative decoration. The ship breaking into 2 sections reorganizes the visual chronology of the end, and the cold defines survival time outside the hull. The immediate after, with blankets, logs, and doors closing, shows the tragedy continuing without spectacle. Titanic's documentary closing isn't one single image. It's a verifiable chain of causes and effects. A great ocean liner can fail through a combination of damage along the hull, structural limits, and human decisions under pressure. The rescue confirms another point. In 1912, survival depended on manual processes executed well, from throwing lines to distributing blankets. Paper documentation made immediately helps explain why some details were preserved and why others remained disputed.